The heavy scent of beeswax and lapsang souchong tea hung in the air of the Manhattan mansion, a stifling perfume that failed to mask the metallic tang of Emily's anxiety. She stood by the massive oak table, her fingers hovering over a linen napkin, aligning its edge with an invisible meridian on the polished wood. Her index finger nudged a butter knife into a perfect parallel line, careful not to smudge the mirror-finished steel with a single fingerprint. A drop of cold sweat traced a slow path between her shoulder blades as the rhythmic, heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the upper landing. The door swung open, and the air seemed to thicken. Without a word, a large hand snapped around Emily's wrist, the thin skin turning a ghostly white under the grip. She felt the delicate bones of her arms shift and grind, a silent plea for mercy that she refused to vocalize, while cold gray eyes locked onto hers. He didn't speak of anger. He simply leaned down to whisper that the coffee was exactly 3 degrees too cold. As the purple welts began to bloom on her pale skin, Emily's free hand instinctively tightened around the leather bag at her side, where a hidden digital recorder sat waiting for a single, devastating slip of the tongue. The heavy scent of beeswax and lapsang souchong tea hung in the air of the Manhattan mansion, a stifling perfume that failed to mask the metallic tang of Emily Carter's anxiety. She stood by the massive oak table, her fingers hovering over a linen napkin. With a precision born of survival, she aligned its edge with an invisible meridian on the polished wood. Her lungs remained locked, chest tight beneath the high collar of her navy dress. Each silver ring on the table had to face north, the family crests staring upward like unblinking eyes. She adjusted a porcelain teacup, ensuring its base sat exactly 2 centimeters from the saucer's rim. Her index finger nudged a butter knife into a perfect parallel line, careful not to smudge the mirror-finished steel with a single fingerprint. A drop of cold sweat traced a slow path between her shoulder blades. Thomas demanded order. Chaos was a moral failing. A spoon tilted a fraction to the right could shatter the morning's fragile equilibrium, transforming a quiet breakfast into a searing interrogation. Emily froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as the rhythmic, heavy thud of Thomas's footsteps echoed from the upper landing. Thomas entered the dining room, the air seemingly thickening around his tall, broad-shouldered frame. He ignored the chair Emily pulled out, instead leaning over the table to inspect the spread. He dipped the tip of his index finger into the dark, steaming surface of his coffee. He didn't drink. He waited. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, his cold gray eyes locking onto hers. Before she could blink, he lunged across the distance, his large hand snapping around Emily's wrist. The thin skin turned a ghostly white under his grip. She felt the delicate bones of her arms shift and grind, a silent plea for mercy that she refused to vocalize. She forced herself to stare directly into his motionless pupils, even as the pain radiated up to her shoulder. The coffee had cooled 3 degrees below the prescribed temperature. He whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the fine china. His thumb pressed into her radial artery, a predator monitoring the frantic pulse of his prey. The scent of his tobacco-laced cologne filled her senses, a suffocating shroud, until he finally uncoiled his fingers. He left behind a cluster of angry, purple welts on her pale skin. The roar of the black sedan's engine faded as it cleared the gates of the new light compound. Emily remained on the stone porch, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, maintaining the facade of the dutiful wife until the last echo of the car died away. The moment the silence of the Upper East Side street returned, she retreated into the foyer. She snatched her leather bag from the console table, her fingers diving beneath the false bottom. She felt the familiar, cold plastic of the digital voice recorder and the rough, textured cover of her small diary. She pulled them out for a mere heartbeat, her eyes scanning for the microscopic hair she had placed across the binding that morning. Finding it undisturbed, she let out a jagged breath. Her heart thrashed against her ribs as she brushed a thumb over the record button, confirming the device was ready. The evidence remained secure. With practiced, trembling hands, she smoothed the lining of the bag, hiding her weapons back within the darkness of the leather. Movement in the reflection of the kitchen window caught her eye. A tall, still shadow by the privet hedge. Mark Reynolds, Thomas's shadow, was watching. Emily immediately grabbed a heavy copper skillet from the rack, her movements transforming into a blur of domestic industry. She rubbed a dry cloth against the metal with a ferocity that made her joints ache. She moved to the pantry shelves, shifting glass jars of grain and spice, creating a frantic symphony of clinking glass to signal her total immersion in chores. The rhythmic thud of wood on wood filled the kitchen, a desperate shield against the surveillance. She refused to turn toward the glass, yet she felt the guard's gaze like a physical weight on her neck. To sell the performance, she began to hum a traditional hymn, though her throat felt constricted by a phantom noose and her fingers cramped from the strain of the act. A faint, rhythmic scraping sound at the mansion's rear entrance broke her concentration. Emily crept toward the service door and saw a flash of pale fabric, Sarah's dress, disappearing behind the lilac bushes. The girl was pressed against the damp brickwork, her slight frame shuddering with small, rhythmic tremors. Sarah's eyes, red-rimmed and swollen from weeping, met Emily's with a look of raw, animal terror. The girl pressed a finger to her lips, a silent plea for sanctuary. Emily scanned the empty, manicured courtyard, her gaze darting to the security cameras before gesturing Sarah into the deep shadows of the laundry room. Sarah lunged forward, her fingers icy and damp as they clamped onto Emily's palm. She begged Emily not to talk there, her head twitching toward the high, arched windows of Thomas's second-floor study. The sheer weight of Sarah's desperation flowed through their joined hands, a cold current that made Emily's own blood run thin. Sarah's breath came in short, jagged hitches as she slowly rolled up the sleeve of her wool cardigan. On the girl's translucent skin, a constellation of yellow and blue bruises bloomed, the marks clearly forming the shape of a man's heavy fingers. Sarah's voice broke as she whispered the details of the previous night. How Ethan, her fiancé and Thomas's golden protégé, had forced her to kneel on piles of coarse rock salt while reciting Thomas's sermons on the sanctity of submission. Emily's gaze drifted to Sarah's throat, where the high collar of her dress failed to hide the chafed, red ring left by a collar tightened too far. Sarah explained that Ethan was now recording her every word in a small black ledger, a mirror image of the control Thomas exerted over the mansion. Every flinch, every downward cast of Sarah's eyes spoke of a soul being systematically dismantled by a man who had traded his humanity for the Reverend's favor. The sight of Sarah's battered arm acted as a catalyst, dragging a buried memory to the surface of Emily's mind. She wasn't standing in a laundry room. She was back in their first small house, the cold tile of the kitchen floor pressing against her knees, the crushing weight of Thomas's palm on the back of her skull. In Sarah's dilated pupils, Emily saw a perfect reflection of herself from a decade ago. The same hollow silence, the same desperate mental gymnastics used to justify cruelty as a path to grace. A phantom pain throbbed in the old scar on Emily's thigh, a rhythmic pulse that synchronized with the girl's sobbing. She recognized the way Sarah tilted her head, a subconscious attempt to shrink, to become a featureless part of the architecture. Sarah's will was a hairline fracture away from total collapse. The same press that had once pulverized Emily's identity, now seeking a new victim to flatten into a shadow. Emily reached out, taking Sarah's face between her palms and forcing the girl to break her gaze from the floor. The air in the small room felt electric, charged with a sudden, dangerous clarity. Emily didn't offer the hollow platitudes of patience or the divine plan that Thomas used to keep the flock in line. Instead, she leaned in until her lips brushed Sarah's ear. She whispered that a world existed beyond the gates of the new light, a place where bruises were crimes, not ornaments of faith. She gave her word, a solemn, whispered oath, that she would find a way to get Sarah through the forest perimeter and past the guards. Sarah went rigid, her breath hitching in a moment of pure, disbelieving shock. Emily gripped the girl's shoulders, pouring years of suppressed, icy rage into the gesture. The bridge was burned. Emily realized that by committing to save Sarah, she was finally reaching back through time to save the girl she used to be. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires of Thomas's car signaled his return an hour ahead of schedule. Emily's heart lurched. She shoved Sarah toward the back exit, her hands trembling as she smoothed her own hair. Thomas entered the living room without removing his heavy wool overcoat, the scent of the cold Manhattan air clinging to him like a shroud. He began a slow, predatory circle around Emily, his nostrils flaring as he caught the faint, lingering scent of Sarah's cheap floral soap. He stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. His eyes narrowed into slits of gray ice. He demanded to know why the girl had been there, his voice a series of sharp, rhythmic strikes. He caught Emily's chin in a firm grip, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw as he searched for the slightest flicker of her eyelids, the smallest tell of a lie. Emily forced her muscles to relax, smoothing the invisible wrinkles in her skirt with a hand that remained miraculously still. She met Thomas's gaze with a soft, practiced smile, the mask of the perfect, transparent wife. She told him that Sarah had come seeking guidance on the intricate embroidery of her wedding linens and the spiritual fortitude required for her upcoming union. Emily spun a detailed narrative of the girl's fictional anxieties, claiming she had calmed Sarah's heart by quoting the Reverend's own recent sermon on the joy of obedience. Her voice was a steady, melodic stream, devoid of the jagged edges of fear. She even added a touch of calculated flattery, mentioning how Sarah had marveled at Ethan's growing righteousness. Thomas's grip on her chin eased, his features softening into a look of smug, self-satisfied pride. Emily watched the tension leave his shoulders as he swallowed the bait, his own narcissism blinding him to the wolf standing right in front of him. Later that evening, Emily sat on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, the faucet running at full strength to create a wall of white noise. She pulled the recorder from its hiding place and held it against her lips, her voice a ghost of a whisper as she documented the day's events. She confessed to the microphone that her years of silence had been the very bricks in the wall of the tyranny Thomas had built. Each word felt like a physical weight being expelled from her lungs. She described the intricate machinery of suppression Thomas used to grind the women of the new light into dust. The truth felt like acid in her throat. This wasn't merely a diary anymore. It was a dual death warrant. She clicked the device off and pressed the cold plastic against her chest, listening through the door to the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the monster sleeping in the next room. The following morning, as the congregation filtered out of the chapel, Emily moved with the grace of a ghost. As Sarah brushed past her, Emily's hand darted out, sliding a small, 4 times folded slip of paper into the side pocket of the girl's bag. On that scrap of paper, Emily had meticulously drawn a map of the deer trails that bypassed Thomas's security outposts, marking the exact time for their rendezvous at the old, rusted mill. Her hand lingered on the fabric of Sarah's bag for a fraction of a second, a silent, tactile signal of the war they had just begun. Sarah gave a nearly imperceptible nod, her face hidden deep within the shadow of her hood. Emily felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. The die was cast. Every movement Thomas made from that moment on would be met not with fear, but with the cold, lethal calculation of a revolutionary. She squared her shoulders and walked toward her husband, the mask of the submissive wife firmly in place. The silence of the bedroom was shattered when the door slammed against the wall with a violence that made the window panes rattle in their frames. Thomas stood in the threshold, his face a pale, frozen mask of fury. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a crumpled piece of paper fluttering through the air. The map Emily had drawn for Sarah. It landed on the silk duvet, the jagged lines of the escape route exposed like a confession. The atmosphere in the room instantly became pressurized, thick with the scent of ozone and impending violence. Thomas began a slow, rhythmic advance, his heavy soles sinking into the carpet with a dull, menacing crunch. Emily watched the vein in his temple throb, a frantic thing trapped beneath the skin. His voice, when he spoke, was a lethal, low-frequency whisper that demanded a reckoning for every line she had drawn, his shadow stretching out to swallow her whole. Emily lurched toward her bag, her fingers grazing the cool leather of the strap. But Thomas was faster. His hand clamped around her forearm like a steel shackle. With a brutal wrench, he flung her across the room. She stumbled, her hip clipping the vanity, before he caught her by the collar of her dress. The fabric groaned as he shoved her into the cramped, dark confines of the walk-in closet. The suffocating scents of cedar and naphthalene filled her lungs as she crashed back into a row of hanging dresses. The heavy oak door slammed shut, severing the light. The sound of the key turning in the lock was as final as a gunshot. Emily hammered her fists against the wood, the rhythmic thudding a desperate plea, but she heard only the fading, rhythmic click of Thomas's heels as he walked away. From the floor of the closet, Emily pressed her ear to the wood, catching the low, rhythmic rumble of male voices rising from the great hall below. Thomas was addressing the elders. His voice drifted up, thick with a calculated, oily sorrow. He spoke of spiritual tremors and dark shadows that had taken root in Emily's mind, painting a picture of a woman lost to a mental fog. The elders grunted in rhythmic agreement, their voices a low tide of collective judgment. One of them spoke of isolation as the only path to sanctuary for a wandering soul. Thomas delivered the final verdict with the cold precision of a judge. Total silence, forced prayer, and the severance of all worldly contact. Emily slumped against the door, the realization hitting her that the walls of her home had officially been redesignated as a prison cell. The door to the closet creaked open, and Thomas's assistant, a man whose face seemed carved from gray stone, entered without meeting her eyes. On a silver tray, he carried a bowl of gray, unappealing gruel and a tall glass of water. Emily's gaze locked onto the bottom of the glass, where undissolved white crystals swirled like miniature snowflakes. A sharp, chemical odor wafted from the liquid, a scent that triggered memories of sterile hospital wards. The assistant placed the tray on a low shoe bench and retreated into the shadows of the room, his body blocking the only exit. In the doorway, Thomas's silhouette remained motionless, a dark sentinel watching his wife through the gloom. The silence in the room became a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. Emily clamped her jaw shut, turning her face away from the glass. But Thomas moved with the sudden, explosive speed of a coiled spring. His fingers, smelling of expensive soap and old paper, pinched her nose shut, cutting off her air. Her lungs burned, and as she finally gasped for breath, he tilted the glass, pouring the bitter, viscous liquid down her throat. Emily choked, the cold fluid burning like lye as it slid down her esophagus. He didn't release her until he felt the involuntary, rhythmic spasm of her swallowing. The glass rim clattered against her teeth, a sharp, metallic staccato. When he finally pulled back, he used a silk handkerchief to wipe the stray droplets from her chin, a gesture so fastidious it was more chilling than the forced feeding itself. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Sheriff Dawson's boots echoed in the foyer below. Emily heard the crisp rustle of legal parchment and the scratch of a fountain pen. Through the slight gap in the closet door, she saw the sheriff standing with his back to the stairs, adjusting his heavy leather belt while Thomas held the edge of a document steady. Neither man looked up toward the second floor. The sheriff signed with a flourish, the sound of the pen, a final nail in the coffin of Emily's autonomy. The snap of the leather folder closing rang through the house. By the stroke of a pen, she had been transformed from a citizen into a medical file. Thomas shook the sheriff's hand, the gold of his signet ring catching a stray beam of sunlight, a bright spark in the gathering gloom. A sudden, heavy lethargy began to pull at Emily's limbs, and the ceiling above her started a slow, rhythmic rotation. She dragged herself toward the small window of the dressing room, her fingers feeling like leaden weights as they gripped the sill. Below, on the gravel driveway, she saw two guards leading Lily and Noah toward a black SUV. The children looked back at the house, their small palms pressed against the glass of the vehicle. Emily tried to scream, to call their names, but her vocal cords felt paralyzed, producing only a thin, wet wheeze. The chemical fog in her brain thickened, blurring the children into indistinct shapes. The SUV doors shut with a heavy, rhythmic thud, and the car pulled away, leaving a plume of dust that obscured her final view of her daughters. Thomas knelt beside her on the floor, his breathing a warm, rhythmic puff against her ear. He leaned in, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm murmur. He told her that Sarah had never made it to the forest line. He described, with a sickening level of detail, how the girl had been caught in the undergrowth and was currently being transported to a re-education facility in the northern hills. Emily felt an icy void open in her chest. Thomas traced the back of his hand down her cheek, a mock caress that made her skin crawl. Every word he spoke felt like a rhythmic hammer blow against her consciousness. The last spark of hope for Sarah flickered and died, leaving Emily submerged in a total, drug-induced darkness. Emily found a broken metal hairpin on the floor and, fighting the rhythmic tremors in her hands, tried to carve the word "help" into the wallpaper behind a row of coats. The paper tore with a dry, rhythmic rasp, but the lines were jagged and faint. Her muscles refused to obey the commands of her brain. Her fingers went slack, and the pin clattered onto the hardwood. Her vision began to double, the room splitting into two overlapping versions of itself. Every attempt to focus triggered a wave of nausea. She looked at her own hands, but they appeared alien, heavy, gray, and useless. The wall in front of her began to liquefy, a gray mass that seemed to be swallowing her last desperate attempt to leave a mark on the world. Thomas returned, placing a laptop on the small table and turning the glowing screen toward her. The blue light felt like a physical assault on her eyes. On the screen, Sarah sat in a hard wooden chair, her face a mask of grief and exhaustion, her hair a tangled mess. The girl began to read a prepared statement in a flat, rhythmic monotone, confessing to her sins and naming Emily as her corruptor. Every word Sarah spoke was a lie born of terror, but to Thomas, it was a masterpiece. Sarah thanked the Reverend for saving her from the precipice. Emily saw the girl flinch at a sound off camera before the screen went black. The realization that her only ally had been turned against her hit Emily with the force of a physical blow. The days dissolved into a gray, rhythmic smear of bitter pills and flickering shadows. Emily began to see things in the corners of the room, monstrous, shifting shapes that wore Thomas's face. A constant, high-pitched ringing filled her ears, occasionally broken by the phantom laughter of the children who were no longer there. She started to question her own memories. Had there ever been a recorder? Was the map just a dream born of fever? Her past felt like dry sand slipping through her fingers, leaving only the crushing, rhythmic thought that Thomas had been right all along. She stared at her palms, unable to recognize the lines, wondering if her entire rebellion had been nothing more than the first symptom of the madness he claimed she possessed. Thomas hauled Emily to her feet and dragged her into the center of the bedroom. He grabbed her leather bag and with a violent jerk turned it inside out. Keys, a compact, and a handkerchief spilled onto the rug, but there was no hidden compartment. He ran a knife along the seams, showing her the solid, single-ply leather. No diary, no recorder. Emily stared at the empty bag, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her. Thomas laughed, a low, rhythmic sound of absolute victory, and declared that her evidence had never existed. Emily stood before him, a hollowed-out shell, her will finally broken. She offered no resistance as he began to fasten the buttons of her formal gala dress, preparing her for her final public appearance. Thomas's fingers dug into Emily's shoulder, a rhythmic pressure that forced her toward the massive oak doors of the cathedral's rear entrance. The transition from the cold stone of the hallway to the pressurized heat of the ballroom was instantaneous. Through the heavy velvet drapes, the roar of 1,000 voices vibrated in Emily's chest, a rhythmic thrum that matched her frantic pulse. The air was a thick slurry of frankincense, expensive cologne, and burning wax. Emily tripped over the threshold, but Thomas yanked her upright, his grip crushing the silk of her dress against her spine. The gold-plated door handles gleamed like teeth in the dim light. Thomas adjusted his cufflinks, his breath a rhythmic heat against her neck, while the crowd's anticipation rose to a predatory howl. In the cramped, dusty confines of the storage room, Thomas slammed Emily against the brick wall. The smell of old wood and floor wax filled her senses. His palm clamped over her throat, a rhythmic squeeze that cut off her breath and forced her to gasp for air that wouldn't come. He leaned in until the tiny, broken vessels in his gray eyes were all she could see. In a voice like grinding stones, he spoke of the white van idling at the back gate, of the orderlies waiting with their restraints and their needles. This was her final destination once he finished his speech. Emily felt the rhythmic throb of blood in her ears as his signet ring pressed into her carotid artery, a cold promise of the oblivion that awaited her. Emily's right hand drifted down to her hip, her fingers disappearing into the heavy folds of her skirt. Deep within a concealed pocket, she felt the hard, ribbed plastic of the digital recorder. It was the one she had managed to swap when Thomas had burned the empty bag, a small, desperate gamble that had somehow paid off. The device felt like a coal against her thigh. She felt the weight of the recordings, the rhythmic, icy threats he had leveled at her and Sarah. Thomas continued to hiss his venom, oblivious to the way Emily's fingers curled around the device, her thumb finding the tactile ridges of the power switch. That small piece of plastic was her only shield, a secret weapon hidden within the very finery he had chosen for her. Thomas pulled a small glass vial from his vest pocket and pressed it against Emily's lips. The glass bit into her gums, and she felt the bitter, rhythmic drip of the sedative on her tongue. He watched her throat with the intensity of a hawk, waiting for the swallow. She mimicked the rhythmic motion of her larynx, but held the viscous fluid in the back of her mouth. The moment he turned to stow the vial, Emily pressed a lace handkerchief to her face. The fabric, heavy with pearl embroidery, drank the liquid instantly. She crumpled the cloth into a tight ball in her fist, feeling the cold moisture seep between her fingers. Thomas nodded, satisfied by her apparent obedience, unaware that his weapon had been neutralized by a scrap of silk. The blinding glare of the stage lights hit Emily like a physical blow. turning the cathedral into a sea of white fog and indistinct, rhythmic movement. Thomas kept his grip tight on her elbow, parading her toward the center of the stage like a captured flag. Emily squinted against the heat of the lamps, feeling the weight of 1,000 expectant gazes. Thomas flung his free arm wide, and the room erupted in a rhythmic explosion of applause. His voice, amplified to a godlike roar by the speakers, boomed through the nave, held Emily up as a living testament to the healing power of submission. Emily stood frozen, her face a pale, rhythmic mask under the spotlights, her spine held straight by a singular, icy purpose. As Thomas launched into a rhythmic oration on the sanctity of the new light, Emily's gaze drifted to the front row. Among the stone-faced elders, she saw Mrs. Green, her hands white-knuckled around a prayer book. The woman's eyes were locked onto the dark, rhythmic bruises beginning to darken Emily's wrists where they peeked from her lace cuffs. A look of raw, rhythmic horror dawned on the woman's face. Emily offered a nearly invisible nod, a silent confirmation of the truth. Mrs. Green's lips parted in a wordless gasp. Thomas pushed his voice higher, a rhythmic thunder that masked the silent exchange. Emily felt a sudden, rhythmic surge of hope. The first crack in the wall had finally appeared. The massive screen behind Thomas flickered to life, showing a rhythmic montage of the community's charitable works. The crowd's attention shifted to the images of smiling children and golden wheat. Thomas, lost in the rhythmic flow of his own rhetoric, allowed his grip on Emily's arm to slacken for a heartbeat. She took a tiny, rhythmic step back, then another, until the deep shadows of the velvet curtains swallowed her. The heavy fabric brushed her skin, a cool, rhythmic caress that hid her from the stage lights. Her heart hammered a rhythmic tattoo against her ribs as she watched Thomas's silhouette against the bright screen. She turned and vanished into the darkness of the wings, leaving him alone in the center of his lie. In the narrow, dimly lit service corridor, a guard stepped into Emily's path. He reached for the radio on his belt, his mouth opening to sound the alarm. Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy, rhythmic bronze candlestick from a nearby pedestal, its weight surprising her. Before the man could speak, she swung. The metal hit his temple with a sickening, rhythmic thud. He crumpled to the floor, his head striking the tile with a rhythmic crack. Emily stared at her hands, the scent of machine oil from his radio filling the air. She felt a rhythmic surge of cold resolve, stepping over his prone form. She gripped the recorder in her pocket, the plastic biting into her palm as she moved toward the control room. Emily burst into the cramped booth, the air thick with the rhythmic hum of cooling fans and the scent of warm electronics. She found the heavy steel bolt on the door and slammed it home. A second later, the door shuddered under a rhythmic, violent impact. Thomas was screaming on the other side, his voice a raw, rhythmic rasp without the polish of the microphone. Through the soundproof glass, she saw the guards throwing their weight against the frame, the wood beginning to groan and splinter. Emily leaned against the door, feeling the rhythmic vibrations of their blows through her spine. She turned to the glowing monitors, her fingers hovering over the rhythmic dance of lights on the soundboard. She pulled the recorder from her pocket and, with hands that shook in a rhythmic tremor, jammed the patch cable into the input jack. Thomas's voice bled through the monitors, a rhythmic snarl of demands and threats. She ignored him, her eyes fixed on the rhythmic bounce of the audio meters. She flipped the master toggles, routing the signal to every speaker in the cathedral. The red peak lights flashed in a rhythmic staccato. On the monitor, she saw Thomas losing his mind in front of the locked door, his face a rhythmic mask of the very rage he preached against. She placed her thumb on the play button, the cold metal of the console grounding her. Her finger hovered over the button. On the main screen, Thomas had returned to the stage, his movements a rhythmic, frantic dance as he tried to explain the technical glitch to the murmuring crowd. The mask was falling. His gestures were too sharp, his eyes too wide. The congregation was beginning to shift, a rhythmic wave of unease spreading through the pews. Emily watched the sweat pour down his face, a rhythmic drip that signaled the end of his control. This moment of total rhythmic power over her tormentor felt like an eternity. She gripped the volume slider and pushed it to the limit, preparing to silence his lies forever. Emily pressed the button with every ounce of strength she had left. A rhythmic, chilling silence fell over the hall, followed by Thomas's own voice, cold and stripped of its hollow grace. Every word he had spoken about selling the community's land, every rhythmic detail of how he intended to break Sarah, blasted through the cathedral with clinical clarity. The room went dead silent, a rhythmic intake of breath from 1,000 people. Thomas froze on the stage, his skin turning a rhythmic shade of gray. The recording played on, his rhythmic, cynical laughter echoing under the vaulted ceiling as he described his followers as a flock of sheep meant for the slaughter. The transition on the giant screen was instantaneous as Emily slammed the display toggle. The rhythmic images of harvest were replaced by the harsh, black and white reality of Thomas's private ledgers. Huge, rhythmic columns of numbers scrolled past, revealing the systematic theft of the New Light's treasury. The seals of offshore accounts in Panama and Thomas's own rhythmic, sprawling signature on multi-million-dollar wire transfers filled the space. The blue light from the screen cast long, rhythmic shadows across Thomas's sweating face. A low, rhythmic murmur rose from the pews as the congregation began to recognize the names of the charity funds that had actually paid for Thomas's secret estates. Thomas lunged for the microphone stand, his fingers clawing at the rhythmic tangle of cables in a desperate attempt to kill the sound. The screech of metal on stone tore through the room, a rhythmic scream of feedback. Emily leaned into the booth's talkback mic, her voice a rhythmic thunder that shook the very foundations of the cathedral. She called out the stolen amounts, the rhythmic dates of the betrayals, her voice a relentless hammer. Thomas yanked a cable free, but the audio continued to pour from the high speakers, a rhythmic avalanche of truth. He stood in the center of the stage, gasping for air, while Emily systematically dismantled his divinity. Emily pushed through the booth's exit and stepped onto the high catwalk. The cold, rhythmic draft of the cathedral hit her face, clearing the last of the chemical fog. She stood at the very edge of the railing, pinned by the rhythmic, overlapping beams of the white spotlights. 1,000 faces turned upward, catching her silhouette against the rhythmic glow of the evidence on the screens. She gripped the cold iron rail, feeling the floor vibrate with the rhythmic, rising anger of the crowd below. She looked down at the small, frantic figure of Thomas with a rhythmic, icy detachment. She stood there, a rhythmic beacon of truth, finally visible to the world. 3 guards in gray suits charged toward the balcony stairs, their rhythmic footfalls echoing on the stone. Suddenly, Mrs. Green stepped into the aisle, her rhythmic, solid frame blocking their path. Within seconds, other women joined her, their rhythmic movements forming a human chain. The fabric of their Sunday dresses rustled as they locked arms, creating a rhythmic, impenetrable barrier. The guards skidded to a halt, faced with a wall of rhythmic, stone-cold defiance. One guard tried to shove his way through, but the women held their ground, their rhythmic, collective strength anchoring them to the floor. The hall became a rhythmic maze of resistance, trapping the Reverend's men in a sea of his victims. Thomas leaped from the stage, his shoes hitting the floor with a rhythmic, heavy thud. He caught Emily at the base of the side stairs, his fingers catching the rhythmic, embroidered hem of her gown. The silk tore with a rhythmic, sharp rasp. He tried to drag her toward the darkness of the service tunnels, his face a rhythmic, twisted mask of hate. But the circle of the congregation closed in. The rhythmic pressure of hundreds of bodies forced him back. Hands reached out, rhythmic, powerful grips that tore his fingers away from her dress. He was swept back by a rhythmic wave of communal fury, and Emily felt the last of his power snap like a rhythmic, dry twig. The massive central doors of the cathedral groaned open, a rhythmic rush of night air clearing the haze of incense. Sarah stood in the threshold, framed by the rhythmic amber glow of the streetlights. Her dress was a rhythmic mess of dust and tears, her breath coming in rhythmic, white puffs. She walked down the center aisle, her rhythmic, slow pace drawing every eye in the room. Emily watched the girl square her shoulders, a rhythmic shedding of her past terror. The catering van Emily had used to hide her was still visible outside, its doors open like a rhythmic, empty cage, a silent witness to the girl's resurrection. Sarah stopped in the rhythmic center of the light and slowly lifted her hands. She pushed back her hair, revealing lips that were a rhythmic, swollen map of pain. Then she pulled back her sleeves, exposing her wrists to the rhythmic, judging glare of the spotlights. The rhythmic red burns and the deep, rhythmic scars from the restraints were undeniable. Her skin looked like rhythmic parchment, thin and broken. Not a word left her mouth, but the rhythmic, visible evidence on her body confirmed the recordings with a rhythmic, lethal precision. The crowd recoiled, a rhythmic gasp of horror rippling through the pews as they saw the true cost of their salvation. A phalanx of elders, their rhythmic black suits like a funeral shroud, surrounded Thomas. One of them gripped Thomas by the throat, the rhythmic demand for an accounting ringing through the nave. Thomas spun around, his eyes rhythmic with the search for an exit. But he was boxed in by a rhythmic wall of his own people. Sheriff Dawson stood by the side door, his hand hovering over his rhythmic leather holster. But he saw the look in Emily's eyes and began a rhythmic retreat into the night. The star on his chest flickered once and then vanished. Thomas was alone in his rhythmic golden cage, the walls finally closing in. Emily didn't look back as she sprinted across the gravel parking lot. The black SUV was idling, its rhythmic engine a low growl in the dark. She found the back door and saw Lily and Noah huddled together, their rhythmic sobbing breaking as they saw her. They lunged into her arms, their rhythmic small hands gripping her dress as if they would never let go. Emily buckled them in, her rhythmic, steady hands a stark contrast to the chaos inside the cathedral. She took one last look at the rhythmic, glowing windows of the new light and slammed the door. The rhythmic click of the lock, the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She climbed into the driver's seat of the old laundry van, Sarah already waiting in the passenger seat with the youngest child. The rhythmic, chugging engine roared to life, the smell of diesel filling the cabin. Emily slammed the van into gear and floored it. The rhythmic scream of the tires echoed off the stone walls as they tore through the main gate. The rhythmic crash of the barrier, a final goodbye. In the mirror, the cathedral and the mansion became rhythmic, receding sparks against the Manhattan skyline. The rhythmic, ancient weight of the new light fell away, scattered by the rhythmic, cold wind of the open road. A month later, the rhythmic, golden light of a Brooklyn morning filled a small, sun-drenched kitchen. Emily set a steaming mug on the table, listening to the rhythmic, scratching sound of a brush on canvas. In the corner, Sarah stood before a moleburt, her rhythmic movements wide and certain. Vibrant streaks of rhythmic red and blue filled the canvas, a rhythmic explosion of life. Sarah no longer flinched at the rhythmic hum of the city streets. The rhythmic white scars on her wrists were still there, but her eyes were fixed on her art, not the door. Emily watched as a new world, rhythmic and free, began to emerge from the paint. Emily pulled a rhythmic, heavy envelope from the mail pile. The official state seal, a rhythmic, embossed promise. It was a summons, with Thomas's name listed in the rhythmic, cold black ink of the accused. She placed the paper on the rhythmic, clean tablecloth and walked to the window. The rhythmic, chaotic noise of the city, the honks, the laughter, the rhythmic rustle of the trees, poured in. She took a deep, rhythmic breath, the air rhythmic and clean in her lungs. The apartment was quiet, but it was a rhythmic, living silence. It was the sound of a rhythmic, hard-won freedom, where every beat of her heart belonged solely to her.